In this review, you will learn about the role played by the Institute of Scientific Atheism. It was created in 1964 by the resolution of the Central Committee on measures for strengthening the atheist education of the population. Basically, we'll discuss how its employees sought to create a positive atheism and how they came to the conclusion that the problem was not only in religion. And as I promised last time, we'll also talk how Soviet ideologists began to introduce secular rituals to fight religion. But before we begin, I'd like to remind you that I based this video review on this book by Victoria Smolkin, a historian from Wesleyan University. It is also important to mention that this book is not about religion, and not even about atheism as a philosophical idea, but about atheism as an ideological project in the service of Soviet politicians. The book argues that in order to understand why religion posed a problem for Soviet communism, we need to shift our attention from religion to atheism. I hope you've seen already the first part of this video, but if not, let me give you a brief summary. In the previous part, I already shared how Lenin changed his attitude towards combating religion from ideological to the militant, and how Stalin did the opposite. In 1943, he shifted the approach from the anti-religious repression and militant atheism to reapproachment with religion. As a result, if in 1939, in the first 20 years of the Soviet period, all monasteries and seminaries were closed, plus more than 50,000 churches, mosques and synagogues were closed or destroyed, with only about 100 churches that still functioned. Plus, by the end of the 1950s, 30% of clergy in Latvia and Lithuania, 45% in Belarus and 80% in Ukraine had been imprisoned. Then after 1943, when Stalin made the decision that was discussed in the previous video, there was a moderate religious revival. Thousands of clergies were liberated from prison camps, and by the year 1954, there were over 18,000 functional churches, mosques and synagogues with registered clerics. We've also discussed in the previous video how under Khrushchev, anti-religious rhetoric returned, but religion was no longer viewed as a political enemy, but more as an alien ideology. Under Khrushchev, there were few aggressive anti-religious campaigns, but the militant atheism has been replaced by scientific atheism and enlightenment through education, plus aggressive media propaganda. Again, thousands of churches and most seminaries were closed. However, reports from the field demonstrated that this strategy didn't really help. Religion went underground. Religious attendance and religious rites were still very popular and in some regions even increased. They realized that eradicating religion by coercion works about as well as eradicating atheism by coercion. And religious consciousness works unpredictably. There is no formulas like A plus B equals C. You cannot always expect logic where religious feelings are involved. One of the key realizations of ideological apparatus was that we need to first fight not with believers, but with the belief. Because religious people are not enemies of the Soviet regime. Indeed, many of them are patriots and supporters of the communist ideals. Atheists simply must find a way to explain them that they are deluded by religious illusions. Party ideologists decided to approach believers not with aggressive restrictions, but with love and care, things that people really need. And this became the second important realization, that we need to focus on human emotions, but not reason. Religion is more a system of feelings rather than system of views. Therefore, logic and science is not the best weapon against religion, and scientific atheism must be replaced with a positive or spiritual atheism that focuses not on negativity and criticism, but on morality and philosophical questions about the purpose of life and death, but of course from secular perspective. That is, the power of religion was no longer somewhere in the outside world. Therefore, eliminating it physically will not solve the issue. Religion was in people's heart, and now it was necessary to conquer their hearts. As a result, during the Brezhnev era, a lot of effort and resources were spent on creating a Soviet way of life and secular rituals that would help people forget about religious practices. Therefore, in this video, we'll discuss about the competition between religious and secular practices. The key event of this period was the creation of the Institute of Scientific Atheism in January of 1964. Victoria Smolkin characterized this period with the phrase, "We must find out where we lost our people." It was a period when social sciences gained popularity and Soviet ideologists in big cities had new tools in their hands to measure real life of people throughout the country. Also, many local research institutes and party organs were created and involved to train a new cohort of personnel who would have both theoretical and practical experience in atheist work. The 1960s was a very different time from, let's say, 1920s. Ideological establishment was aware that atheism needed to address already our kind of religion, not the one that necessarily opposed science and even communism, but rather a religion that spoke to social and moral questions. So, how do we compete with such religion? As one high-ranking official stated at the first meeting of the Institute for Scientific Atheism, the new task of atheist work was to focus not on how believers imagine God, with mustache or beard or without them, but instead on the role that believers attribute to supernatural powers in human life and in the life of contemporary society. Which meant that the power of religion lies not in its truth, but in its functions. In other words, we must find what the customer wants and give it to them, but under different ideological cover, not forcing with stick, as we have tried before and failed, but by substituting it with our religion-free product, so that ordinary people understand what is so attractive in a materialistic worldview. In the media propaganda, the focus shifted from negative anti-religious topics to the positive elements of atheism that appealed to the reader's emotions. Those were everyday topics, questions of morality, happiness, the meaning of life, and so on. Some professors from atheist department expressed their concern about the real danger of primitive atheism. For example, Victoria Smolkin quotes this message. "We have one atheist lecturer from KGB who looks at even the most ordinary Baptist as an enemy. We tend to look at believers as politically unreliable, dangerous individuals. In these conditions, no atheist work is possible." Also, Victoria Smolkin, after analyzing data from atheistic forums in the Institute, shares other examples. Someone from Department of Scientific Atheism of Moscow State University complained that it is time to understand the complex dynamics of religiosity through individual psychology and experience. The times of dividing people into atheists and believers are over, and the standard formula, such as a person fails on hard time and is dragged into a sect, was a harmful primitivism. It could not explain the essence of religion. And if we are going to imagine believers in this way, we are going to fail. They also explain the importance to remember that religious forms and traditions have accumulated over centuries. But the most difficult art is the art of working with people, and clergy knew how to talk to people heart to heart and how to heal their spiritual traumas. But the atheist propaganda was lacking such experience and skills. Another challenge is how well-educated atheists could find a way into the lives of simple illiterate people. Representatives of the Institute also came to the conclusion that pointing out to contradictions in the Bible is also not very effective. Progressive believers respond that the Bible is as contradictory as life itself. There are no problem with those contradictions since it reflects the imperfection of human reason. Some concluded that if we ignore the real problems of people, they will get disappointed in the promises of communism and would turn into religion. Examples were given of exemplary communists who gave up their party membership and joined a sect. And here I would like to notice that back then it was common to call a sect any religious groups besides some major ones like Orthodox or Catholic Church. Even Baptist or Methodist church would be considered a sect. Anyway, I won't give more examples because I hope the main idea is clear. Now, what is the solution? To coordinate research and atheist work, the Institute for Scientific Atheism formed a scientific council. Within 2 years, the institute had established 40 regional centers across the Soviet Union, many of which were in major urban centers or areas with high concentration of religious communities, such as Western Ukraine. These centers focused on sociological research and on training of new personnel. The primary objective was to study local religiosity in order to formulate policies that would improve atheist work on the ground. Their research needed to illuminate why a believer turned to religion and what atheists could do to change this. This institute organized many conferences and published tons of research and educational materials. By the way, it was also charged with running the country's top graduate program in the study of religion and atheism. So the work began, country's best philosophers, historians, and ethnographers were involved. But social scientists also had to become ideological activists. They also had to explain what an ideal Soviet atheist looks like, what they believe in, what rituals and holidays they observe and which they don't, and what they see as the meaning of life and death from the perspective of the Soviet ideology. This way, their atheism had to not only defeat religion by explaining why it was wrong or harmful, it also needs to fill people's mind with a positive meaning and worldview. This way, atheism itself turns into an ideology, and this is what distinguished the Soviet atheism. After 2 years of work, a report was submitted to the Central Committee of the Communist Party. On one hand, it acknowledged that religion disappears. Most people no longer practice it, the reproduction of religion in new generations has decreased, the ideological work is improving, it has become more thoughtful, new personnel are trained, and so on. But then numbers were presented. There is still 15 to 20% of believers in cities and 30 to 35% in villages. In some regions, the percentage of religious rights remained very high and even increased. Protestant churches are constantly growing and influencing the youth. Plus, in the villages, 80 to 90% of people still had icons and icon lamps at home. Even some party members hypocritically baptize their children, have icons, and observe religious holidays. That is how there they are, traitors are among us. So they decided to change some strategies and divide the collected data by age, gender, profession, nationality, and take into account their emotional and psychological factors. That is, to be able to understand what exactly compels them to turn to religion. For example, the elderly, who had previously been seen as lost cause and left outside the sphere of atheist work, now became a new target. The research revealed that the older generation had a critical influence on the upbringing of children. Since most parents worked and frequently depended on grandparents for childcare, grandparents could insist on baptism, sometimes even refusing to care for unbaptized grandchildren. So they had to organize elderly clubs and women's clubs to have more ideological control over this group of people. Those findings also revealed that religion was not a static phenomenon, but rather could have different meanings for the same individual over the course of their life. In other words, if a person is not a believer at their 30s, it doesn't mean that they won't embrace religion in 20 or 30 years from now. At the same time, religious rites like baptism in most cases had less to do with articulated beliefs and more to do with satisfying the wishes of friends and relatives, as well as observing the norms of the local community. Some people interviewed even reported that they don't believe in God and they don't trust the priests and hate to pay money for the ritual, but baptize their kids simply because this is an old tradition and everyone is expected to do so. By the way, David Wilson, Jaron Diamond, and Daniel Dennett, among many others, in their works have explained what is the cost of non-participation in group rituals. It has been so for thousands of years, and few people want to be an outcast for not following what is natural for their community. Therefore, it is difficult to determine whether people are believers or not simply by exploring their practices. Religious consciousness is one thing, and religious behavior is another. Sociologists of religion like to say that religion consists of 3 B's: belief, belonging, and behavior. Is it enough to have only one of them and being considered religious? And what must be focus of atheistic work, belief, belonging, or behavior? As one prominent communist ideologist, Duluman, stressed, it was important to be clear about what category of people they need to work with. Studies have shown that some people recognize themselves as believers and observe rituals. The second category recognize themselves as believers but do not observe any rituals. And the third recognize themselves as unbelievers but observe rituals. Many people also perform rituals simply out of habit or tradition. Some of you may remember that in my video about secularism in Denmark, I've mentioned about the studies conducted by Phil Zuckerman and how he reported that some Danish that are atheists in 3rd generation still baptize their children in church, simply because it is a beautiful tradition. It has nothing to do with their beliefs. A British sociologist, Abby Day, in her book by Oxford University, Believing in Belonging, argues how a well-conducted qualitative study can open up many missed gaps of quantitative study. Properly asked questions can bring a researcher to very different findings. She was able to demonstrate that the earlier statistical claim that there is a large number of Christians in the United Kingdom, over 70%, was not the case, since many of them are cultural or nominal Christians. They suggest that belief orientations could be anthropocentric and theocentric. And if we think carefully, then indeed, some people are connected to their religious groups not through faith alone, but also socially. Therefore, it is important to focus on the interaction of social contexts and individual motifs. The preservation of social and kin relations matters to some more than worldview issues. It may force them into a form of performative religiosity or belonging without believing. This also suggests that the sociality may be the key to understanding human behavior, and that religious belonging is also a social belonging. But let me put aside my reflections and let's get back to the book. In general, researchers at the Institute of Scientific Atheism had many questions about the typology of believers and what goals should be set and what tactics should be used to achieve them on the ground. If the ultimate goal of Soviet atheism was to achieve a society free of religion, then atheists had to understand where contemporary religiosity was being produced. And to do so, researchers needed more qualitative than quantitative data and had to put more emphasis on interviews rather than surveys. According to Smolkin, an important and even turning point in the development of Soviet atheism was the Panzer project, conducted in Panzer region from 1967 to 1969. It was the major sociological study of the religious landscape in the USSR under the name Atheism and the Spiritual World of Man. Eventually, the Panzer project not only confirmed the fears that propaganda does not create atheists, it also exposed that modernization does not necessarily lead to secularization. And here let me step aside and briefly explain what secularization theory means. Sociologists throughout the world in the 1950s and 1960s predicted that the modernization process would lead to the decline in religion. Almost everyone was convinced that religion would gradually fade in importance. Advances in science and technology will lead to rationalization and modernization. Therefore, the demand for religion and religious authority will decline. However, by the end of the 20th century, and even today, many claim that at the moment secularization thesis on the global scale has been proved wrong. Islam and Christianity are growing rapidly around the world, with only Europe seems to be an exception. Therefore, despite modernization, progress, technology, internet, social media and so on, religion is still feeling great in today's world. On the other hand, Ronald Inglehart in his recent book Religion's Sudden Decline claims that secularization recently accelerated. He argues that between 1981 and 2007, most countries became more, not less, religious. Therefore, counter-argument against the secularization thesis was justified. But if we focus on the recent data from 2007 to 2020, then we'll find that the overwhelming majority of countries that were re-examined in 2020 became less religious. So even today, there is an ongoing debate between scholars over the secularization thesis. But I'll discuss it soon in one of my future videos, so please subscribe to my channel and press the bell button to be updated about new videos. Also, there is an opposition from non-white or non-European scholars that look at secularization not from a Christian, especially Protestant perspective. Because if, let's say, in sub-Saharan Africa Christianity is on the rise, does this mean that before that those people were not religious? Not at all. We simply should not measure religion by our Christianity-based biases. Similarly, in the Soviet Union, religion was not only about Christian or Muslim religious practices, it has much deeper roots. Soviet atheists, based on the Panzer project, wanted to understand, when religion transformed under the pressure of modernity, what beliefs and functions die off and what remained, or how they transformed. So they tried to dig deeply, and what they found was that the collected data revealed that, of course, not all believers simply follow the tradition. Religion also takes believers beyond the limit of earthly concerns and interests to something sublime. And by the way, atheistic education did not have such an impact and didn't have much to offer to really dedicated believers. But the good news was related to what we've discussed before about cultural Christianity or belief, because it meant that out of 40% of people that claimed to be religious, many were not committed believers or religious practitioners, but simply cultural or nominal believers. You know, they are those who visit church once in a while just for Christmas or Easter. But what shocked them the most were findings that among 60% that claimed to be non-believers, only 11% were convinced atheists. Atheism never found a way into their hearts and never became a part of their spiritual world. The atheist ideologists realized that the traditional spectrum with the religious fanatic and conceived believer on one side and the unbeliever and convinced atheist on the other was no longer sufficient. Atheists had come to realize that it was not enough to destroy religious belief. Even if you do so, this does not mean that people will turn into an atheism. Do you understand what I mean? An unbeliever was not the same as an atheist. The category that was growing most noticeably, especially among young people, was indifference. Most people consisted of religious doubters, passive atheism, or simply those that don't really care or even think about religion or atheism. So what does this mean? That it is not enough to simply distinguish the atheist from the believer, but also from someone who was indifferent to both religion and atheism. This way, indifference emerged as a critical category of belief, and the Institute noted with alarm that it was the fastest growing category on the spectrum. Therefore, some propose that atheist work focus on the middle of the spectrum, religious doubters and passive non-believers. Traditionally, atheistic work targeted mainly committed believers, but now, in order to be more productive, it is necessary to direct the main efforts precisely to the middle of the spectrum and turn religious doubters or indifferent into convinced atheists and communists. Victoria Smolkin states that indifference was problematic for at least two reasons. First, it undermined Soviet claim about the moral superiority of socialism over capitalism and Soviet atheism over bourgeois atheism. And why it is important? Well, because Soviet ideologists over years insisted that what distinguished social atheism from its bourgeois counterpart was the fact that it is not just negative but had a positive component as well. That is, Soviet atheism did not just show the falsehood of religious beliefs, but also filled the spiritual world of the Soviet person with a true scientific atheist worldview. And let me ask you, what do you think about such claims? Does this mean that atheism is not just a rejection of the supernatural but an ideology in itself? Don't you see a contradiction here? Can an atheism be a tradition with particular practices and institutions that can be observed and studied? And does this mean that there is a need in atheism as an ideology even after religion has disappeared? In other words, how did Soviet atheism imagine it? Does this also mean that there is such thing as post-atheism? Anyway, it raises lots of interesting questions. After all, in the 21st century, many atheists would claim that atheism is simply a denial of supernatural. That's it. Atheism is not related to values or morality. It cannot be an ideology. In this case, if someone claims to be an atheist, then all it tells you is that this person does not believe in supernatural. And this statement in no way informs you about their values or beliefs. They could be an ardent communist or a liberal, a pacifist or radical sadist, a hunter or a vegetarian, a supporter of Kim Jong-un or Bernie Sanders, far-right Nazi or social rights activist, racist or cosmopolitan, or even be a religious fanatic. They can deny the existence of God and the creator of the universe, but at the same time believe in various conspiracy theories, astrology, or the healing power of amulets. It does not tell you anything about their race, sex, or ethnicity, about their worldview on human rights, climate change, and so on. Of course, there is a statistic that suggests atheists tend to be more supportive of women's rights or LGBTQ+ rights, and they tend to vote Democrats. But still not everyone. In other words, atheism is not an ideology in itself with a determined set of values. However, the Soviet atheism presented itself as such. Anyway, let's get back to the book. The second reason why indifference was a problem is because it was observed above all among Soviet youth. This meant that the Soviet system was not effectively transmitting the communist system of values to the next generation, and it put the survival of the entire enterprise at stake. Yes, they won politically and ideologically, but now, when the indifference came to worry the party even more than religious beliefs, it was necessary to fight for the formation of a communist way of life. They must make this way of life attractive, especially for young generations, and to them it became the final battleground for the Soviet soul. So what was done? They found that many people interacted with religion during rites of passage, marriage, birth and death. Thus, the power of religion lies not in its truth, but in its functions. Traditionally in the USSR, it was quite bureaucratic procedure. You come at the civil registry office, the ZAGS, and simply register the event. This way, for decades, it was not considered an ideological weapon, but rather a boring bureaucratic procedure. During one of the meetings, Leonid Ilyachov, who headed the party's ideological commission, I mentioned him in the last video, so he noticed that religious rituals play a big role in bringing people to the church. Moreover, the beauty of the service and the splendor of the cathedral satisfies their aesthetic sensibility, while anti-religious propaganda does not. Therefore, as he said, it was time to think seriously about our civic rituals, about endowing them with more solemnity, making them more attractive. So they did. The party decided to invest a lot of resources in the creation of new ritual spaces, services and material attributes, ritual art and songs, trained professionals, and of course socialist rituals themselves. The ritualization of Soviet life began to be considered the party's most powerful weapon in the battle against religion, and thus central to the ideological work. The government began to allocate a lot of resources to reconstruct registration offices into the wedding palaces. Often they became the most beautiful buildings in cities and villages. And indeed, when I was young, in my hometown, we called the civil registration office the wedding palace, and it was an amazingly beautiful building, both outside and inside. And the same thing you may find in many other cities or villages on post-Soviet area. The government also began to pay a lot of attention to the socialist right of birth registration. Children were given beautiful medals with the image of Lenin, and it worked. When the baby palace was opened in Leningrad, today's St. Petersburg, they tried to give maximum splendor to the rite of newborns so that it could compete with the solemnity of baptism in churches. The percentage of baptism in the cities fell sharply, and it looked like a battle of business competitors. Party ideologists even emphasized that the rite in the baby palace cost only 1 ruble, but if you go to the church, it will cost you up to 10 rubles. Of course, it took a lot of time until this project was realized, but the work was carried out. By the decree of the Council of Ministers of February 18, 1964, on the introducing of new civil rituals into Soviet life, a central council was established to oversee the socialist ritual project. A huge bureaucratic apparatus was working to teach the Soviet people how to live correctly ideologically. After all, they were already fighting religion not as an illusionary faith, but as a way of life. The project was taken seriously, and many rites of passage experienced transformation during this period. Special tombstones during funerals, the assurance of the Soviet passport, the first bell ceremony at the first day of school, initiation into the pioneers or the Komsomol, the sacred nature of labor was emphasized, and to switch people's attention from religion, there was an attempt to find an alternative to all major religious holidays. Special requirements were introduced to the employees of the Civil Registry Office. They went for special training, they were given ceremonial clothes. Anyway, everything was done to give more solemnity and attractiveness to the ceremony. On the other hand, the church had to react. It forced them to improve their services, modernize rituals, improve music, and so on. Sorry, I won't go into specific details. You can read about the details of this competition in the book by Victoria Smolkin. I'd just like to mention that it worked in a way. Even today, in the post-Soviet area, people keep reproducing some secular rituals invented during the Soviet era without even realizing that initially they carried specific ideological tasks. To expel religion from society and to unify various nationalities across the Soviet Union under one kind of Soviet tradition. But to a greater extent, people perceived them not as a replacement for religious rites, but as an addition to them. And that became the main problem. Many young couples, after celebrating their marriages at the wedding palace, went to the church as well. As a result, secular rituals never really worked as an atheistic weapon. Look at these posters. They just make fun of this duality. It states, "This is how a hypocrite lives his life between heaven and earth. As to satisfy the co-workers, we would play by the rules of the party, but to get good presents from parents and grandparents, we would go to church for marriage, baptism, or Easter." This way, many Soviet people lived a double life. Moreover, during the Brezhnev era, more and more people, especially the creative intelligentsia, was not just sympathetic to religion, but portrayed it as the center of the country's spiritual heritage or national traditions. For example, if during early Soviet period people could happily go and watch how the church was destroyed or icons burned publicly, now they began to appreciate these things, and the temples were already looked upon as historical and cultural heritage. Also, young people became interested in cultural heritage. The ideologists of socialism complained that the creative intelligentsia in their works even creates a positive image of religion. There was a growing interest in idealistic philosophers, a revived interest in tourism to sacred places, and so on. Religious rites looked to young people as folk rites, as a link between the past and the present. They began to glorify the historical accomplishments of the church and moral merits of religion, and conversely express irony and even distaste towards atheism. On the other hand, some people became disillusioned with the ideological utopia promised by Khrushchev and turned to religion because of the inner emptiness, but others simply remained indifferent to any worldviews. In other words, they failed to become passionate about the Soviet lifestyle and communist promises, and it was not clear what would pass into the next generation. To conclude, yes, it was obvious that decades of the atheistic propaganda produced some result. The influence of religion as a belief in the supernatural has weakened and significantly. Sonia Luhrmann, in her Secularism Soviet Style, states that in Volga Republic there were only 13.5% of declared religious believers, and 37.8% say that they were indifferent to matters of religion. But ordinary people did not understand why, in order to be a good Soviet citizen, they had to actively profess atheism. And probably the main revelation was that the communist value system was not reproduced in the next generation. Many people did not believe in the Soviet project, and this became a problem even bigger than religion itself, because the goal of Soviet ideologies was not just to kill religion, but to win people's heart with communist ideology. Until the 1970s, the atheists' main concern was that secularization was not moving as quickly as Marxism-Leninism had predicted, but there was still confidence that secularization embodied the logic of history, and that history ended with the disappearance of religion and arrival of communism. Remember what Khrushchev said? "I will show you last priest on television," or "soon religion will remain only in museums." But during the 1970s, the hope was shaken. It was also painful for the fact that the creative intelligentsia refused to participate in the atheistic project. On the contrary, they showed interest in the religious heritage and spiritual issues. Finally, Soviet youth, from the Paris perspective, were becoming increasingly consumerist, in both the material sense, in their fetishizing of Western consumer goods, and the spiritual sense, in their growing indifference to worldview questions. Yes, young people were indifferent to religion, but they did not fill their hearts with the dream of communism. And this was the biggest disappointment. Their hearts remained empty. And for the party it was catastrophic, because they believed that if they could not fill the hearts of the younger generation with their vision of the future, then an alien or enemy ideology would do it. Therefore, Victoria Smolkin believes that it was the fear of this indifference that prompted the Soviet leadership to once again turn to religion as a political problem and force. But this time, they decided not to reject religion, but rather to bring it back into politics. But more on that in the next and final video, when we'll discuss about religion under Gorbachev and the post-Soviet time. Thank you for your attention. Please like and subscribe, and consider supporting me on Patreon.